Maybe we can wait 2 more minutes. Is that okay with everyone?
So we were trying to show this movie, so when as people were going to be coming in, I'll speak very slowly for people who just speak Spanish. But the computer wouldn't play it. So when you go home, if you want to play these films,
Películas.
It's youngvoicesfortheplanet.com, and they're only 6 minutes long. Muy corto. ¿Sabes corto? Muy corto. And they're meaning
All right, I know for some of you, super fans here of Lynn's work, so she needs no introduction. But thank you, Lynne, for seeking out the Institute on this visit. And it's a pleasure to getting to know you more. And thank you for your work. I say that now as a mom, and so it's even more meaningful to me to have good children's books out there and stories that go beyond those written books. So thank you very much, and thank you everybody for coming. Gracias por estar aquí y gracias a Lynne por su trabajo. Ya como madre aprecio mucho más este trabajo, no solo como conservacionista, pero ya como madre significa mucho más. Y voy conociendo a Lynne en este proceso y estamos muy felices de tenerla.
Gracias. Y gracias a Fran y todas las personas aquí for, how do you say having me? For invitar. For me invitar? Invitarme. Invitar, for invitarme. Thanks for inviting me. trying to learn Spanish. Okay. Thanks to Mariana for taking this lovely picture of me. It's going to look very nice. And Mariana also designed the advertisement for the Bosque Eterna de los Niños, which is where I am artist in residence right now. And thank you to Lindsay, it's Lindsay over there, for giving me this artist in residency and bringing me to Monteverde. I'd also like to thank Syria, because Syria has given me a really nice home. And she speaks to me in Spanish all the time. And she's frustrated with me, but I'm better than when I first came. I think. Okay. Yes. Okay. So, I originally was here 30 years ago. And I came to research this book. And I think I'll just pass it around so you can see the insides of it. Flute Journey, The Life of the Wood Thrush. I had done the book, The Great Kapok Tree. I'll be showing you more about that later. And I realized there was no connection between the rainforest and our forest up north. So I wanted to write this book about how the birds fly down from where I lived in Maryland, all the way down here, and then back again, and all the problems that they face, all their trials and tribulations. And so when I was here, I wasn't sure if the wood thrushes were really here. But Nalini Nutkarni, she was sure that they were here, but I needed to actually see them myself to know that, put them in a book. And so Nalini told me that Bob and Susie Law had a bird bath in their backyard, and that sometimes a wood thrush came. This is Susie Law right here. Thank you, Susie. So I stayed at Susie's actually for a while too when I was here 30 years ago. And this was their bird bath, and they let me set up a camera at their window, and I took these pictures from their window of the bird bath, and that bird bath is still there. And I think the wood thrush still comes there like 5 o'clock every afternoon. It's really pretty nice. So when I was a little girl, I lived in a house that beyond the house was all woods and all fields, and I could run all day long and never see another house. But I didn't really do that much running. I did a lot of sitting. And I noticed that my cat would sit absolutely still, and that's how she hunted. I mean, she would just pounce on something. And when she was sitting like that, it was like she was invisible. If the animals wouldn't see her. So I thought, well, what if I just sit like that? Will I be invisible? And so I learned how to become invisible. I would just sit there, sometimes for hours, not moving, and eventually all the animals would come out, and they would ignore me. They wouldn't even know I was there. So I got to see nature on its own terms. And I'd come home and I'd say to my mom, those opossums or those chipmunks, they all have different personalities, and I could recognize the individuals, and they have relationships. And she at first didn't believe me, but then I started bringing them to the house, and then she saw that they indeed had different personalities. So on this particular, in this particular instance, I was sitting there, and this female pheasant came right up to me and just poked my foot. And since then, I've had a lot of birds come and just land on me and poke me to see if I'm alive. Because I guess the animals think if you're not moving around and making a lot of noise, that you're not really human. So it's really a wonderful thing. So I was in love with this woods, and I got to know where every hole, what animals lived, every hollow log. And then I came home one day and they were bulldozing it, and they completely destroyed it. And that was like my entire life, was just gone. Because at my house, yeah, sure, that's my life. But this was really my soul. And I thought something was wrong with the world if that could happen. So I wrote a lot of books when I was 8, and this one was Kitty's Adventures. And a lot of these have Spanish subtitles because I actually gave this talk at UNAM in Mexico about 5 years ago. So this was a book I wrote about Kitty's Adventures. And as you can see, I've improved a little bit as an illustrator from when I was 8. And kids say, well, how did you get better? And I just practiced. Every day I drew, just like She wanted to learn to ride a bicycle. You would just do it every day, right? Or learn to speak Spanish. Just do it every day. So I just got little by little, better and better until I sent that book to my publisher, and they said, that's a really good story, but we'd like you to redo the illustrations. And so this was the book, Archie found me, but the same story that I wrote when I was 8. And I like to show this to kids to show them that when you're 8, you can have these stories, you can have these experiences that you might even forget by the time you're an adult. So keep a journal and write down whatever you can about your life. And I guess that's a good piece of advice for adults too, because you don't remember everything. So then I grew up and I heard about the destruction of the rainforests. And I just couldn't believe it when I first saw this. Like all the brown areas, that they're all clear cuts. Like they cut down every single tree. And then some of the light green is where they have clear cuts, but some are growing back. But it's not old growth growing back. I mean, that takes 1,000 years to grow back. So I thought, this just kind of, this feeling that I had when I was a kid of that loss of my forest, it's like it all welled up in me. It all was there, and it all came back, and I just thought, I've got to do something. And so I talked to Tom Lovejoy. I don't know if any of you know Tom Lovejoy, but he was a very famous biologist. He just died last year. He was my mentor. And he said, well, if you want to write a book about the tropical rainforest, you have to go there. And so he brought me there to his study site, kilometer 41. And I would go every day and just sit in the middle of the forest. And all these animals would come out. And I'd get to see them up close. So on this day, I was sitting there and I heard this sound coming from the underbrush. Like a, and I thought, oh no, it's a jaguar. And, well, what do I do if it's a jaguar? And do I get up and run, or do I just jump off and yell boo and try and scare it? And what it was a 2-inch long hummingbird. That was my first hummingbird experience. So I was greatly relieved. But it was wonderful to be able to see these animals. So I wrote this book, The Great K-Pop Tree. And what I hoped was that it would get translated into languages and be spread all over the world. That has happened. And that kids would read it, and then they would do something to try and save the rainforest. So this is some of the story. The man goes into the forest, he falls asleep. Come on in, if you want to come in. And as he sleeps, the different animals come down and they explain to him the reasons why he shouldn't cut the tree. And there are all the things we know about how everything is interconnected, and that pollination and all the ecosystem services that it produces. So the most exciting thing was when the kids read this book and then they started writing letters. We want to do something. And one of the things I started to do was I wrote to the Bosque Eterna de los Niños, because I met Rachel Crandall, and she was using the book, and I asked them to help raise funds for the Bosque Eterna de los Niños. So that was pretty exciting, turning that into actually rainforest. But what these kids would do is put on these amazing performances of the Great K-Pop Tree. And this was a musical. And I went to see it, and it was amazing because I found myself at the end. I ended up crying at my own story, because it was as if it wasn't my story, hearing it, and I realized the power of these animals talking to the man about not cutting the forest down, and it had this power. So lots of stories about kids saving money and sending it to save rainforests. Then I started going around the country and talking to kids all over the country, actually all over the world, but mostly in North America. And these kids told me the story of how they had this forest, and it was an old growth forest in Michigan, and how they had loved this forest, and they heard it was going to be cut down. And they asked the teacher, what could they do? And the teacher said, well, why don't we go talk to the developer? So they went to the developer, these third graders, and said, can you please save this forest and not cut it down? He said, well, I can't just give it to you, but I can sell it to you for $100,000. Back then, this was a lot of money, especially for third graders. So they said, well, you don't have $100,000. But the teacher used it as a math problem, and They divided the number of trees into they divided the number of trees into $100,000, and they came up with $14 a tree. And kids said, well, we can just try saving tree by tree. So they started bake sales and walkathons, but the most important thing they did was they wrote letters about the importance of this forest and everything they'd learned by studying it, and it got in the local newspaper. And then they got asked to speak on the radio. These third graders talked about the science. They talked about the importance of protecting it on the radio. And then they got asked to be on TV. And once they were on TV, so many thousands of other young people and everybody saw them, and they started sending them money. And so in 6 weeks, these kids raised not $100,000, but $200,000. And they bought the forest, and there's $100,000 there for protecting it forever. So these stories, these just kept coming, these stories, and they're just so exciting about what the power that the kids had. Once the kids say, this is what adults should do, adults tend to respond. So this is down the street, you've probably seen it, the children, they're trying to rainforest. This is actually on the porch of Susie and Bob Wall, and Dave was especially friendly with this agouti and this round egg. And so when I saw this, I just thought, I have to write a story about these characters, because don't they look like they're right out of a children's book? Anyway, Bosque Turner de los Niños, I'm sure you've seen this map before if you've been to Bajo del Tigre, it's up on the wall, but just how many acres have been saved by these children throughout the world. And we're now writing a booklet for the Bosque about the history and how these Swedish school children were told by Sharon Kinsman, scientist, about this amazing place, and they started raising money. They initially raised enough for 6 hectares of forest, and they bought it, and that's protected. But then what they did became known worldwide, and kids all over the world started sending in money and trying to save this. So now it's gotten quite big, but there's still so much to do. This is what we're talking about, is as children send in funds, and part is for reforestation and part is to outright buy it, but hopefully now that I've been here, and we'll do this booklet, and I'll be able to tie the Great Cave Tree more to the Bosque now, and hopefully we'll be able to even get more interest. And there's also, I think, I don't know, it's going to be a couple years, but a film being, it's in the early parts of this project, a movie of the Great Cave Tree, which would be fantastic. And if that happens, then a lot more people would know about this. This is the Great Fig Tree. This is here. We have a lot of great trees here. They're just, that's me inside the tree. It's quite an experience. And is that Ixicropia?
Yes.
There's just such amazing, huge trees. Like you could have the great anything tree. Maybe the kids here in the schools want to write stories about the great fig tree or the great. Because back in the States, a lot of kids were writing the great oak tree or the great, these trees that are, and then writing about the particular relationships that the animals in that particular tree have to other. And so back in 1950, there was, you can see how much land there was here, the green, not so much protected, but actually forested. And then by 1983, there was hardly any of the original forest left. And then this is in 2010, after people started actually saving the forest and planting forests, and you can see it's actually gotten a lot more forest here because of people's actions and the children trained forest. So Flute's journey, I mentioned a little bit about how I wanted to make this connection. And you see the red house there? Well, the land above that was called the Belt Woods. And where that red house is, that person eventually sold some of that land, and that was deforested. But when I started writing this book, these people at the Tuxet Wildlife Research Center who were studying the wood thrush, they were really concerned about protecting this. And there was a guy named Seton Belt, and his family owned this land, and it had been given to them as a land grant from the King of England. That's how long they'd had it. So this was an old growth forest, 15 minutes from DC. And it had more migratory birds here than almost any place else in the whole United States. Because it was all around, it was like all deforested, and everything had to funnel into this. So a huge wood thrush population. So when I came into this project, they were doing this research on the wood thrush, and you might have heard of Chandler Robbins, because he wrote some of the bird books before the Peterson guys, and he'd been studying the birds there for 40 years. But it turned out that Seton Bell had died, and he in his will said that they should never cut the trees and never sell the land. But he wanted to give it to some group that he knew would protect it. So he thought about the Nature Conservancy, but it was pretty young back then, so he gave it to the Episcopal Church, his church, and they promised that they would never cut the trees and save it. But they got the will overturned, and they were going to sell it, they were going to develop it. And so Chandler Robbins, he was then about 95 years old, and he was just apoplectic, that this forest would be destroyed. And so I said, well, I'll talk to the children. I'll see if, having seen what these children did around the world, see if they can help save it. So as I was going around the country, I started telling this story. And so I told, so I was telling the story, and these kids in Texas, they were all little Episcopal kids in an Episcopalian school, and they started writing letters to the Episcopal Church. And then this got picked up on the news, and then somehow it got to Sunday morning news with Charles Osgood, and these kids read their letters on Sunday morning news with Charles Osgood. This is a program in the U.S., I think it has thousands, if not millions, of viewers. And so they were standing in the woods and reading these letters. Seton Belt trusted you. How can you go against him? Another kid wrote, you got the land for free. Can't you take the $4.5 million that the Trust for Public Land has offered you and save the land? And another kid wrote, God is going to be really mad at you. It was that last letter that really changed my minds, especially since the bishop of the church, as he's crossing the street the next day, he gets hit by a car. And not really badly hurt, but the next week they had a press conference. He came to the press conference in a wheelchair, and they announced they were selling it to the Trust for Public Land and that it would be protected forever. And so again, it's just the story of the power of young people and their sense of morality. So in the book Flute's Journey, it comes down here, you recognize some of your birds, because on the front end papers, it's the birds in Maryland. In the back end papers, it's the birds in Monteverde, plus the birds in Maryland, because they're your birds as well. And this is at Stella's. I was lucky enough to see quetzals when I was here before, flying in and out of the nest, entire day, just beautiful birds. One of the things that really struck me was the Costa Rican money. I thought, does what a country puts on their money have anything to do with their value system? And if so, well, we know that the Costa Rican values, Costa Ricans value animals, forests, nature, beauty, art, and that money says everything. And when you look at ours, it's like, well, what do we in the United States value? Looks like war, military force. So it's been a real eye-opener being here and just seeing the difference in the value systems of the countries exemplified by our money. And I asked the kids when I spoke at the Monteverde School, so do you think if we could get the U.S. to change its money, to actually redesign its money, it might have some effect on the way they view the world? So well, maybe that's a good project. So this is the team I'm working with. There's Mariana, and that's Karen. You're here, Karen, right? Somewhere. There's Karen. And Karen's actually doing a lot of looking at the way things have been, evaluating Lindsay, and there's our biologist and Natalie. And this is at the Del Tigre, where it's wonderful to go hiking. We got the guides. Nalini is who brought me here the first time, because she was the one who told me I should come. She had a study site here. And I thought that we're doing this booklet, but also the back of the Great Cape Out Trees, to suggesting to kids that they research scientists, people who are doing a lot of this, finding out about what we know about the rainforest, which are the biologist, and Sam Kinton, who was the biologist who got the Swedish kids to give money. She's up in Maine. That's a spiny lizard. Spiny green is a lizard, right? Yeah. Just have such amazing, that's a spiny green tree. Lots of amazing things. Monos, toucans, and bromeliads. Nalini is studying bromeliads, and there's a whole collection of bromeliads back here. And she actually was one of the first people, I think she was the first person actually to study the rainforest canopy. She actually got ropes and climbed up top. And her professors are saying, oh no, it won't be that much different than the rest of the rainforest. And she'd seen these bromeliads falling down to the ground, saying, well, some of them had water in them, some of them had frogs in them, some of them had frog eggs in them. Clearly there's something else going on. So she started going to the top of the canopy and studying it. And these bromeliads, it turns out, have a whole different ecosystem. And that would make a great book for somebody to write up. Beautiful views. Coatis. And there's so many things to write books about. So this is a book called Making a Difference in the World. It's just about a lot of the issues that I'm concerned about in my life and the books that I wrote about them. This was called "We'll See the Storm in the Mangrove Tangle," about how mangroves protect the shoreline from erosion. And in a lot of these storms, you'll see when they come in and all the coastline is just gone. But the places where there were mangroves, it's saved. So now there's a big effort, and a lot of kids are doing this, actually planting mangroves. And this is about how an ecosystem starts very small and it builds up and gets more and more complicated. I wrote this with Gary Grosh in 2008. I believe it was the first book about climate change. Gary had started a project called Worldview of Climate Change. He'd gone all around the world trying to figure out ways to show people what climate change was through photographs. So he went everywhere, the Arctic, the Antarctic. And I was so fortunate for 15 years. He was my partner. We traveled all around the world. We went to Australia, and we were talking to a scientist there who had noticed that the animals that he was studying were moving up and up and up the mountain, wondering why this was happening. And then he theorized, well, maybe it's because the climate is changing and they're trying to stay in the temperature gradient. And then he did the research and found that that was true. That everything was moving up, trying to just stay in that same temperature gradient that it was used to. And then the frogs on the top, there was no place for them to go. So they went up to heaven. And so I had about 10 different artist in residencies for this book at all these universities and institutes, and followed the scientists around and put their research in it. So it's all about forests and oceans and all the different ways that we know that climate change was happening. And this was back then. And back then, in 2008, it was really frustrating because there was this huge effort by ExxonMobil to confuse people about climate change and disinformation. And it's kind of a shame that we weren't like trying to tackle this in 2008. That's simple. Oh, I think I'm going to come back to this one actually. So what's been really heartening is these young people who are really taking climate change seriously. They know that it's going to be their world. And so they're taking to the streets and they're working for political campaigns, and they're trying to reduce the emissions. So one of the things that I learned in teaching about environment is that if you just tell people doom and gloom, like, oh, everything's getting polluted, climate change and deforestation, that it gets people really depressed. And they kind of push it away. They don't want to even hear about it. So early on, I realized we have to tell people the success stories, which is why this is mostly success stories, about, especially success stories about what kids have done. And so I thought I wanted to do a series about kids, success stories about kids fighting climate change. And so Gary and I started this nonprofit, Young Voices for the Planet, and we raised enough to make, over the course of a decade, 13 films about kids who have actually reduced CO2 emissions. And these are free and online. They're only 6 minutes each, and they're really uplifting and inspirational. So for kids, if you know kids who are sort of depressed, thinking that there's no hope, these give kids hope. And I wish I could show them to you, especially this one on the bottom left, because these three girls, they actually say, we were so depressed, we were so sad, we didn't know what to do. The adults weren't doing anything. And it starts out, and then they find out that there's an opportunity for them to testify at their town meeting, because there's a law that was passed that would not allow solar panels on town buildings. And they went at 11 years old and they testified and said, this is going to be our world. We need renewable energy. And they got a standing ovation and they got the law overturned. And then the town, they put aside funds to put solar panels on every public building and at the town landfill and on the school because of these 11-year-olds. And they cut the ribbon at the ribbon cutters, these 11-year-olds. So, just really amazing stories. And then Mari, who's in the middle, she says, we had no idea we had this power. We thought we were just little girls. And then it's such a heartening movie. And then in the bottom right, that's Jason Mellors. And I filmed her when she was 13. And when she was 10, she was testifying at the city council in Bridgeport. Because those smokestacks you saw, that's what she lived next to. And they were just, all the kids had asthma. And she, at one point in the film, she says, it's kind of an online epiphany. She said, I think it may be an issue of environmental racism, that all these power plants were in her neighborhood. It's a really powerful film. So then she starts speaking out at 10 and at 13, and we have her speech, giving her speeches. She gets standing ovations everywhere. And then at the end she says, again, I didn't know anyone would listen to me, but words have power. And that's the name of that film, Words Have Power. So I won't go into all of them, but the boy in the middle, Milo, he's gotten cities and towns all over the world to stop using disposable plastic straws, and instead they're using reusable metal straws for paper straws. And I noticed that Monteverde is already there, which has been pretty exciting. But they're all worth watching, and I hope you'll watch them and share them with young people. These girls decided to do an energy audit of their school, and they reduced their school's energy cost by $53,000. They saved their school $53,000 in energy costs in Florida. And this is Jason, who I was just mentioning to you. I've been going around with her to visit colleges. She's now about to go to college. These are the girls who testified at the town meeting. There they are. They also saved a huge tract of land behind their house. They set a corridor for the animals. And I know here there's a lot of people trying to create this bellboard corridor from the lowlands up to the rainforest and planting the how do you say it? Trees. Okatea trees, and planting the okatea trees, which I think would be another great kids book if anyone feels like writing that. Felix has planted about 1 billion trees now. I filmed him when he was 11. He's now 21. He was a keynote speaker at Davos in Switzerland. He's on if anyone is on Facebook, I have a post of him on Facebook talking to Jack Dangermond, who's this president of Esri. So I could go on and on, but I'm going to stop here because I think this is what it's all about, really. You know, we have these pictures from space and everything's black and it doesn't seem like there's life anywhere. And we have this miracle right here, this beautiful blue and green planet. So that's very motivational to try and reduce our human impact on the world. We certainly do have a big impact on the world. But here in Monteverdi, it's just been very heartening to see everything that's being done and the values of simplicity and care for nature. I was watching the movie Sweet Home Monteverdi. I had not seen that, and I've been an activist my life, but this really, just something inside me, it really changed me, thinking how can I even be paying taxes back in the US? You know, could I just come here and live this life that's an exemplar of what the world could be? You know, or do you have to be fighting? You know? And then there's a professor who's quoted in the movie Max, I don't remember his last name, but he's a professor of Quaker studies, and he says that what the people who came to Monteverdi originally were thinking is that war and violence in a society, if you live in that society, then you're not living a life of peace and of spirituality. So they decided to come here and try and live this life. But he also said that you also have to always be aware of the potential violence in yourself, and the war in yourself. And I think that's what Quaker Meeting is all about. It's like you go in there just really every week thinking about, you know, have I been the best person I could be? You know, have I been living the values that the original people who came to Monteverdi done? Just imagine the whole world that way, right? Mm-hmm. So anyway, thank you so much for coming. Really so thrilled. And if any of you have any questions, please, I'd love to hear your questions or just even comments about what you're doing here that I might not know about. ¿Preguntas?
When you're coming to live here.
Necesita comprar mi casa. Is that right? Comprar mi casa. The casa aquí is muy bien. It's been really exciting staying with Syrian Alvaro because they recycle, they compost, and are very concerned about water usage. Like all these things that, you know, how I live, but I feel like my friends are always having to, you know, but here it seems to be that's part of the value system.
Are you working on any books right now? Or what's your...
Yeah, I'm working on a little booklet, booklita, I guess, what do you call it, booklita? Librito. A very little 24-page book. I'm working with people at the Bosque Eternidades things. It's sort of a group effort writing it, and then I'm supposed to be doing the illustrations. I just have to do the illustrations, so that's a little thing. A book I just finished writing is about a bear in Florida, a black bear, who, is anybody familiar with Florida at all here? A few people. Florida is known for being like super developed, you know, like people, when I say a bear in Florida, people say, a bear in Florida? You know, they're, because they don't think of it as wild, but there is this whole wild part of Florida. It's in the middle. And so this bear, this radio collar, they put a radio collar that beeps, goes beep, beep, and they can tell exactly where it is and follow its location. So 10 years ago, they followed this bear, and it went for 3 months all the way from the south of Florida up to the north to, you've heard of Disneyland, right? Yeah. All the way to Disneyland. And it wasn't fun for him in Disneyland because there was no green space, just one little place. And then he gets stuck there and then has to come back down. But he's just trying to find a place to live and comes back down. But in following his nose and doing this route, he informed people where the places were that needed to be protected and that could be conserved to create this wildlife corridor. And this was so unbelievable because Florida is so conservative, but the legislature passed a bill unanimously and bipartisanly to put aside $30 million to protect this corridor, to buy up pieces of land and to buy up easements on them, so that panthers and bears and other animals would have this connected corridor throughout Florida. This was really incredible. So I'm writing a book about the bear, and as he goes on this little voyage through Florida, and which will be able to go into the schools, and kids can learn about this corridor, and then as they grow up, they can be sure to donate money to save more open space to make this corridor bigger and more robust. So that's kind of an exciting project. Yeah. And then here, I have so many ideas, but I think what I'll do is I'll write them and I'll just let other people illustrate them, because the illustration takes forever, but I could write them. So I thought I'd do that one about the brown jay and the agouti. I don't know what it would be, but I have there are lots of stories that present themselves almost every day here. Maybe a history of the bend. That would be a good children's book. I mean, of Bosque Eternal de los Niños. Any of you have any ideas? What I should write?
The agouti and the jay one, that's what I want.
The agouti and the jay. So how about, do you want to say something about what's happening here at Monterey Institute that might be, you think might lend itself to a story? I keep forgetting the name, but the OCologies, the seeds.
Oh,
Okay.
the Opopea.
Okay,
That
so
Daniela
say
can talk about.
Yeah. What?
No.
Oh, Danielle.
That is a picture here. Yeah, definitely. As you were saying, there are so many stories that you can tell. But I think through my experience working with the Cocotea monterrensis specifically, there are many other Cocotea species in town too, is that when you tell the story of a specific animal or individual, people get to connect with them. And we usually use animals because they're easier to connect with. Plants, we don't usually use them, so I think that is one of the biggest things we have learned with the Mio Cotea project, is that when you give a tree a personality, that's all you need for people to connect with them, and to understand the importance of plants providing for wildlife and for us humans too. And this is just one story of one of our trees, but really we have so many others that are also endangered, and that we also want to, for the community and for people to know more about them. So that is a process we are we're under right now. It's like learning what are the stories about these other species of endangered trees from the area that we can tell people so that the community can connect with them as well, right? But first we need to learn about these trees and what is it that they need, so that what is it that we expect people to do, to help the trees. Because as you were saying, just informing people how bad things are is not good. It's like what can we do to change the situation, what we need to inform.
Yeah.
And sometimes we don't even know what that is.
But it sounds like you're kind of onto something with the project you had, Mio Ocotea, where you had people planting, farmers are protecting their ocotea trees and planting more ocotea trees that are protected. And you have some studies with the bellbird, right? The bellbird, how they eat this ocotea. I could see us maybe a book with 5 stories. It's the ocotea tree and the bellbird, and another tree and another bird or an animal. And just have 5 short stories about how it is they use those trees and to personalize the trees through the animals. Maybe I'll work on that with you.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah.
That'd be great.
Now that you mentioned that, bueno, I guess first thank you for being here and for sharing your experience and your expertise, not only with us but with the whole community. And hearing you say that makes me think that all the different interactions, and it's one of the things that I think I have seen also through Lynn's eyes as she's been here and through other people's eyes, is learning about the different organizations and different efforts and different things happening in Monteverde. That something along the lines of what you just mentioned could be really interesting too, looking at key species like ocotea, like bellbirds, like quetzals, like the biological corridor, and looking at kind of the my English is failing me. looking at the way things interact and depend upon one another, and giving some of those key species and areas personalities is something that could really benefit and I think speak to a lot of the different initiatives that are happening throughout the area.
I actually love that idea that sort of taking each of these stories is the initiative of one of the organizations or institutes here, and it would be it really would be a nice way of connecting. And then if you had people who were involved in doing the book, that they give talks and it's sort of a way of bringing everybody together.
Or choosing a geographical area like the Bellbird Biological Corridor, for example, as the framework for the species that are chosen to tell the stories. Would be interesting too.
Yeah.
I would just like to mention that there's a lot of research now on trees communicating
Oh yeah.
with each other in community and supporting species or a tree that may be under stress, and that would be a great thing to incorporate in these stories is that research.
Yeah, that's, I think Suzanne Simard is the one who's really famous. I mean, a lot of people have been doing a lot, but she's the one who wrote this book, The Mother Tree. If any of you haven't read this, it's like mind-blowing book about how trees communicate through the mycorrhizal fungi under the ground. Yeah, and the pheromones they put out and all. Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, just incorporating that into that somehow too. Or maybe a separate book, right? Yeah. Another book is, that's a fantastic book, is by, it's about the oak trees. I forget what it's called, something oak. But the author of this book has been studying for decades. He's been, it's Doug Tallamy, and he's been studying which birds eat which caterpillars, which only lay, which come from butterflies, which only live on a particular tree, leaf of a particular tree. So basically, if you want to attract rose-breasted grosbeak or whatever bird, that if you plant a particular kind of oak, that you will be attracting the food for that grosbeak so that it can raise its young. And this is, I bet everybody here would just love this book. But Doug Tallamy, it's Tallamy, and he's all over the internet. He must give 2 talks a week.
He
Zoom.
actually used to bring groups to Monteverde every
Did he?
year.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, to the UGA campus in San Luis.
Did he really?
Yeah,
Oh,
so he
gee.
knows this area well.
Oh, okay.
The nature of oaks.
The Nature of Oaks, thank you, yeah. Boy, I love that book. I'll read it again. Yeah. Well, thanks. One more?
Yeah, thank you so much for this. Like, just hearing you is such an inspired journey. like inspiring me in the journey. And I would like to know maybe some of the difficult things, some difficult story you have during this wonderful journey, right? Because I just hear you and I'm so inspired.
Thanks. Did you see Nalini Nadkarni's talk last week?
No.
Nalini gave a talk last week, and I thought it was just so on the mark. She said, you know, when you give a talk or when you go apply for a grant proposal, you only show your successes, you know, and you don't show all the failures. And she said that there's so many more failures along the way than the successes. And I thought that was so profound, and I was so glad that she said that. And she also said, you know, sometimes when you just feel so upset, you know, like you're just so demoralized by what's happening in the world, it's really hard not to stay there, you know, just to go to the place of hope and focus on doing something and not let yourself get dragged down into the morass of some of the things in the world. So I'd say I have the same issues, you know. I'm so aware of the problems in the world, but I think it's the kids, you know. When I speak to kids, you know, you can't be telling them all this terrible stuff. It's not, for one thing, it gets them really upset, but it's just not fair, you know. And the fact is, they do have power, and the fact is, they can change the world. So why not focus on that? You know, so that's what I've chosen to do, is just to focus on that. And I'll just tell you one story. Have you ever heard of motivated avoidance? Motivated avoidance. Okay. Well, when I would go to these science conferences for at least 10 years, Gary and I, my partner who I wrote the books with, we would go to these conferences, and the scientists would get up and they would just be spewing all the science about climate change, saying, if only people knew the climate change, if only people knew the facts, they'd be doing something about it. And having already given the facts to people and to kids and seeing it doesn't motivate them, it just makes them spiral down and want to go jump off a bridge. So I would raise my hand and say, you know, you have to present hope, you have to have success stories. Bill McKibben's talks, and always made me feel like going home and doing myself in. And I knew since we were 20, I said, Bill, you can't just tell us this horrible stuff. You have to give people something hopeful. And you know, at first, for probably a couple of years, it's like it'll go away. Finally, enough people were saying it. Certainly not just me. But what happened is this study came out in the Journal of Behavior and Social Sciences, a Canadian journal, and it said, people, when they're confronted by what seems like a traumatizing and troubling and intractable problem that there's no solution to, their inclination, they're motivated to avoid hearing about it ever again. They push it away. And then I watched this happen, you know, because if I would just talk about just climate change and people go with this, and then you can't get back in. But if you start with the success stories, if you start by showing, look what these kids did, you know, look at these new technologies, look at this, and you start with the success stories, then you can go and start talking about the problem, because they're not going to go into the state of motivated avoidance. So that was really important that the study came out, and it was done by scientists, so it wasn't like Lynne Cherry telling you scientists what they should do. And so there was this phone call that I used to get on every Tuesday with about 1,000 scientists from around the world. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but certainly at least 100. And when I would just be Lynne Cherry saying, well, you know, you really need to be telling hope and success stories. One actually said to me, can you please shut up about this hope and success stories? I'm not kidding. And then that was it. I just didn't want to talk to them anymore. Well, after this study came out, I got back on that phone call. We haven't heard from you in a really long time. What's up? Well, I just saw you want to know about this study in the Journal of Behavior and Social Psychology about motivated avoidance. Nice big long name, right? And I explained it to them. Silence. Well, thank you very much. You know? And then at the next conference, they're coming up to me, what was that called? What was that called? Motivated avoidance. And then it was probably 6 months after that I went to this conference, and this big biologist with this bushy beard, and somebody goes, and they're all talking about how to teach people about science. And she says, well, you know, we can't just be telling the science. We have to be using success stories. And about 10 people in that audience turned around and went. But it was 10 years. It was 10 years. Yeah. So, you know, you just have, who said, Elizabeth Warren, right? Persevere, persist. What's that? You just gotta persist.
Nevertheless, she persisted. Nevertheless, she persisted.
Nevertheless, she persisted. Yeah, and you know, you have your ups and downs where you think you'll never get out of the down again, and then something excites you about, you know, kids doing something, or I don't know. So, at least that's what it is like for me. That I understand if, you know, it just gets to be too much for people sometimes. But yeah, I think it's just the hopeful stories. Focus on the hopeful stories. Share them with me. Like them on Facebook. I mean, you'll see some of the ones I share, but also if you have any, just, you know, share them. 'Cause that's what it is. It's like to share the hopeful stories. So I hope I made you feel hopeful.